Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Mark Thornton about the heroin epidemic and his article, The Legalization Cure for the Heroin Epidemic. Dr. Thornton is Senior Fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and is the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. He has served on the faculty at Auburn University and is the author of numerous books, including The Economics of Prohibition, Tariffs, Blockades, and Inflation, The Quotable Mises, and the Bastiat Collection. You can follow his work on Twitter at Dr. Mark Thornton, on the Mises Institute's Facebook page, and on the Mises Institute's website, which is mises.org. That's mises.org. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/heroin. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Adam, it's great to be with you, and no issue is there more need for a wake-up call in the heroin epidemic that's going on in this country. And it's not just that people are using this product, but it's the number of people dying. And we're approaching a figure of close to 50,000 people per year that are dying from drug overdoses in the United States, which is almost as many people who Americans died in the entire Vietnam War. And so we really do need a wake-up call with respect to this issue.
Well, let's hope that we can provide that today. And this has become an issue of increasing importance and relevance to so many individuals and so many families. And we're seeing it discussed more and more on the campaign trail as far as the presidential campaign goes. And we're seeing it being discussed more and more in the mainstream media. So hopefully we can shed some light on what's happening and what the proper solutions might be. But
Amen.
Since we'll be focusing primarily on the heroin epidemic today, let's just start. And this may seem like a very basic question, but there are a lot of people who probably don't have a good definition in mind. So what is heroin?
Well, heroin was synthesized from morphine in the 19th century. And really the only difference between morphine and heroin is that heroin is generally more concentrated, more potent drug, but it also crosses the blood-brain barrier. So it has a direct intoxicating effect on the brain itself, and it stimulates pleasure sensory parts of the brain, and that's what makes it so attractive, so effective in certain medical issues, but it also makes it more addictive. And so that's the problem with heroin, is that it does have gives the user a euphoria that is so intoxicating and so addictive, and that's why it can be a problem even on the free market.
All right, and since we'll be talking about the heroin epidemic within the larger context of the war on drugs, let's define that term. What is the war on drugs, and can you give a brief overview of how the war on drugs began?
Well, in America, there's always been this urge to try to clean up society by enlightening our fellow Americans, and of course that began a long time ago. Even before we were the United States, Americans were saying, okay, you shouldn't be drinking alcohol, you shouldn't be drinking whiskey or rum, we shouldn't let the Native Americans drink alcohol. So it goes back a long ways. It wasn't until the Progressive Era that it was really made a national issue. And the first thing that was made illegal were narcotics, cocaine, heroin, morphine, things of that nature. And they were actually just regulated, but the regulators decided to impose an overall prohibition on those narcotics. And then, of course, we had the experience with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, and marijuana was taxed out of the market in 1937 by the Marijuana Tax Act. And these didn't have significant effects really until the 1960s and 1970s. And President Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1972, reclassified the drugs, reorganized the bureaucracy, and really made a big push to make drugs completely illegal. And so it's really thought that Nixon really started the war on drugs, and of course it's been perpetuated through the 70s and 80s and 90s, the first decade of the 2000s. We're starting now to see a reversal of that war, which is so great. And basically the war involves, the passage of laws, the establishment of penalties, going out and rounding up drug dealers primarily, but also hundreds of thousands of consumers, putting them through the court system, throwing them in jail for long periods of time. And of course, the penalties have increased during the Ronald Reagan presidency. And so it's a gradual intensification of making certain drugs illegal. And by the way, this also includes hemp, which is not a drug at all. It's just a plant. And so the process is driven by the fact that prohibitions like this don't work. And so when they don't work, politicians call for more resources, greater penalties, relaxing rules of police behavior, so that supposedly they can make some inroads, but it always backfires. And so far the process has been one of push forward, see the negative results that they get, and actually get worse results, and then the politicians and bureaucrats crying for more and more resources and penalties. And so it's been a cyclical pattern throughout our history, and I'm hopeful that we're watching the last stages of the increase in the war on drugs, and I'm pretty sure that what we're seeing right now is the initial stages where where everything devolves and the war on drugs unwinds and hopefully disappears altogether.
Well, we've definitely seen some very encouraging developments, at least as relates to the legalization of marijuana in Colorado and Washington and a few other places. But returning to the heroin issue, when did heroin become illegal, and how did heroin become a part of this broader war on drugs?
Well, heroin was made illegal under the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914. And basically this took heroin off of the over-the-counter medications and eventually took it out of pharmaceutical use. But it wasn't really a big problem to begin with. Heroin products, such as Bear heroin, served a good purpose. And especially if you were in a rural area and you had a bad back or a broken leg, it was pretty important. But there were other drugs to fill the role that heroin and cocaine had filled. And so really heroin didn't reemerge with any significance until the 1960s. And a lot of that was driven by the fact that Vietnam veterans returning from the Vietnam War, many of them had developed addictions to heroin and the habit of smoking marijuana. And of course, many of them were suffering stress diseases from being in combat like that, as you can well imagine. And so they continued to seek heroin. And so that really opened up a bigger market for the product, in the illegal market, I should say, for the product in the 1960s. And, it's addictive. And so it opened up this market and it started to spread, basically. And but it mostly faded away, I think, as the Vietnam vets became unaddicted. The heroin product problem was very localized in places like New York City, Los Angeles, California, and San Francisco, California. And it really didn't impact most of the country until the last decade or so.
Yeah, so how did it come to impact the rest of the country? Because we've definitely seen it spread from a handful of urban areas to suburban areas to rural communities. How did that spread come about, and how did it come to impact these other locations?
Well, it's very, very interesting. The sort of poster child for the heroin addict in the 1960s and 70s was the urban junkie who was homeless and, shooting up with dirty needles and all of that. And it was very, very localized and confined to a very small number of places, and actually faded away somewhat in the later 1970s and 1980s, only to reemerge. And it reemerged first in suburban areas outside of the highly dense populated urban areas. And so it started to spread out into the suburbs. And this was basically came about because heroin, relative to marijuana, is a much smaller product. Okay, so think of it this way. You could bring 1,000 doses of heroin in a small prescription bottle, but 1,000 doses of marijuana would fill up an entire grocery store bag. And so heroin is much, much smaller, and it can be imported or smuggled into the country in 100% pure form. And so it has an advantage over smuggling marijuana. And when Reagan ignited the war on drugs, what we saw was first a switch to cocaine and then crack cocaine, and then followed that by heroin. And so it was basically an economic phenomenon in the black market, which gave things like crack cocaine and heroin an economic advantage over the much safer and non-deadly and really not truly addictive marijuana. And so as this cost advantage started to take place, more and more of it was shipped to suburbia and to like high school students, and people started dying. Young people are particularly susceptible to it. And basically, if you take too much heroin and you don't really know how much you're getting in one of those little packets, because the purity, once it crosses the border, is cut down as it goes from the importer to wholesale to retail to street dealer. It gets cut, but the consumer doesn't know what the potency is. And so if you take too much heroin or you take it with alcohol, you'll stop breathing and your heart will stop functioning, you will die. And so that was a big problem. But the more recent surge in overdose deaths of heroin involves another layer of government, not just the Drug Enforcement Agency, but the medical industry, which is largely controlled by the federal government. And basically, the medical companies have been able to bribe the Doctors Association, the FDA, and everything in between to get drug recommendations for pain upgraded from what they used to be in previous years, Tylenol 3, ibuprofen, and the like, to prescription drugs like Oxycontin and Vicodin. And Oxycontin and Vicodin are very similar chemically to heroin itself. And so if per chance you are a fisherman in Maine and you have your leg broken while working, or if you're a coal miner in West Virginia or Pennsylvania and you're injured by cave-in and you're taken to the doctor in both cases, and the doctor sees the broken leg or the broken shoulder or whatever it happens to be, they now routinely prescribe Oxycontin and Vicodin, a.k.a. heroin, for that problem. But it gets, of course, even worse because doctors are also told that they can't overprescribe these drugs. So as soon as the leg is healed or as soon as the shoulder is healed, the patient gets cut off from a product that they've likely become addicted to. And so this is an awful scenario for fishermen and coal miners because they normally can't afford a 30-day drug addiction program, which very often doesn't work. And so they have to turn very quickly to the black market where they can buy Vicodin and Oxycontin pills. The only problem there is that instead of a $20 prescription, they're asked to pay $10 to $25 per pill. And so that's economically not feasible for your typical fisherman, your typical coal miner. And so the next alternative they get to turn to is illegal heroin. And so we're creating these addicts, cutting them off, and we're forcing them into the black market and eventually, in many, many cases, to heroin, which is probably more addictive than the pharmaceutical grade products. And that's where you have, your ordinary middle-class Americans all of a sudden finds themselves as heroin addicts and not really knowing the things you're supposed to know to avoid dying from the product. And so that's where the large amount of overdoses is occurring and why it's spread out into what we once thought of as places where people would never even consider. And these are people who would never, ever consider using heroin. It's just the power of addiction is underestimated by many people, including the government. The government has put them in this position where the guidelines on drug use have been changed to get them addicted, and then they've also prevented them from being on a maintenance program or a maintenance withdrawal program, and they find themselves with no other choice, basically.
All right. Well, we'll definitely return to the subjects of pharmaceutical drugs and black markets and potency in a little bit. But since you mentioned that we've seen a surge in heroin overdoses and use, now you have offered some statistics already, but what statistics are available and what can you say about the trends, not just in heroin use and overdoses and deaths, but also as far as illegal drugs as a whole go?
Well, the U.S. is approaching 50,000 deaths per year from overdoses of all sorts. 20,000 of those are currently attributed to legal painkillers like Oxycontin and Vicodin. And at least 10,000 people die each year from heroin overdoses, and there's thousands of people who are still dying from cocaine overdoses. I personally believe that these figures vastly underestimate the number of deaths that are related to prescription drug use, because I see a lot of anecdotal evidence that people are dying not from these powerful painkillers necessarily, but from a lot of different types of prescription drugs, and that doctors are prescribing, I think in 2014, that there were enough prescriptions written so that every man, woman, and child in the United States was given 13 different prescriptions. And, every prescription out there basically has side effects and warnings associated with it. And those side effects, even though some doctors do a very good job of making sure that the prescription drugs are correct for the individual and they know the other drugs that they're taking, the patients certainly don't know. And they're not sure what to be alert of in most cases. And so as you're taking more and more prescription drugs, the likelihood of side effects and negative consequences is enormous. And, when you look at the deaths associated with these drugs, they're very alarming. But the U.S. also keeps track of the number of emergency room visits. And I don't have those statistics at my fingertips right at the time, but they're typically something like 10 times the number of deaths. And so we may be looking at 500,000 emergency room visits associated with drug use of one sort or another, excluding alcohol.
Well, it's just staggering and alarming to hear those statistics and to hear those trends. So let's return to the subject of black markets. Now, you've touched on this some already, but just how does the war on drugs help to create black markets, and what roles do black markets play in reducing the quality of products and changing the way goods and services are exchanged, and how has that in turn contributed to the current heroin epidemic?
Well, the black markets are the results of government intervention. The government declares that certain drugs or certain activities are illegal, and by nature, not everybody's just going to go along with those kind of decrees. And as a result, those people find themselves hiding out in the black market or the underground economy, where they're able to make purchases of the products that they use, they enjoy, they're addicted to, whatever it happens to be. There's still going to be a large number of consumers that want that product. And as the initial supply dries up and the price goes extremely high, people start establishing organizations to provide those drugs at very high prices. And this could be, a small-time marijuana farm, or it could be organized crime on a massive international basis. And these organizations, their main goal is to avoid detection, and so they're very sneaky. They can't rely on police protection for themselves or courts or property rights or anything, so they're very often in desperate situations, and so violence becomes a big issue here. But as I mentioned earlier, as the government ramps up the war on drugs, well, it makes the risk of these organizations greater. That pushes up prices, but it keeps supply coming. But the entrepreneurs respond by offering a different set of products. And so one example of that is bringing the heroin in pure form in small packages, and then as it goes down the supply chain, they cut the potency with either harmless or harmful substitutes, things that look like the original product but are much different. And so we have uncertain quality, we have uncertain potency, and in contrast, for example, in the free market, bare aspirin is always the same strength. Now, it may come in regular strength, it may come in extra strength, it may come in maximum strength, but you really have a good idea up front how strong the product is. And it gives you guidelines as to how many to take, what's the maximum number you can take, what are the side effects, and so on. But this isn't the case in the black market. And so in my dissertation, I got access to some data that I wasn't supposed to have, but it showed that the potency of marijuana when the war on drugs started in 1972 was 0.4 of 1%. By the time, I think it was 1983 or 1984, the average street potency of marijuana was 4%. In other words, it was 10 times stronger in a very short period of time. Now, the potency on today's market, I'm told, is several-fold higher than that. And so you're talking about possibly an average street potency of 10%, and in many cases, much higher. So the war on drugs is self-defeating. You're actually making things more dangerous than prior to the war on drugs or even in the early stages of the war on drugs. But these black market entrepreneurs respond to these incentives. And, and that's true also for the underground market in prescription strength painkillers. And so the government law enforcement bureaucracy can never overcome these problems because they only can make the problems worse. And you've seen various episodes of this in the past where they've made a big concerted effort to try to stamp out the black market in drugs. And, they'll make a haul of, $2 million of marijuana or, $3 million of heroin, only to see only a sharp increase in the price that very quickly fades away. In the 1980s, President Reagan appointed Vice President George Bush Sr. to be the first drug czar. And one of the first efforts that they did was to try to completely shut down the illegal marijuana market in cocaine. And so they brought out the military, they brought out the Coast Guard, they searched every plane or ship, even personal boats were searched, and they very quickly did dry up the market for marijuana. But within a very short period of time, the smugglers had switched to smuggling cocaine. And so while the celebrations began amongst the drug warriors, the ports of Miami and Jacksonville and Tampa and so forth were being smuggling cocaine became a very prominent change in that market, and no one really thinks that that's a good result, because marijuana is not deadly. It's usually not harmful in most instances, but cocaine clearly is a danger. It comes in very potent forms and can have negative consequences for your health. So, that there's nothing that they can really point to where they've permanently come out on top. They only have very short Pyrrhic victories, and in the long run, things have been, enormously negatively affected. Our prisons are full. Our court system is logged up. And when we look at each of these prisoners or each of these overdose deaths, these are not just harming the individual, they're harming their families. And as anybody in your audience can well imagine, if your 16-year-old brother or one of your other relatives died of a heroin overdose, I mean, that's a crippling negative effect on an entire extended family. And so these consequences are much greater. These negative consequences are much greater than simply listing the statistics, because it's not just the one person. It could be 30 or 40 people who are psychologically, emotionally harmed as a result of what these drug warriors are doing.
Well, and those are very important points that are usually not a part of the narrative, and definitely not a part of the mainstream narrative when discussing the war on drugs and discussing the issue of drug prohibition. But it is very important to look at the changes in potency of the drugs, to look at the increased likelihood that you'll have toxic chemicals mixed with the drugs. And we're seeing this, of course, a lot with heroin. And to recognize that while heroin or cocaine or these other drugs would be very dangerous in a free market setting, they become even more dangerous when you add the prohibition aspect to this. And the same goes for the switch that you discussed in many people's drug use from marijuana to other more dangerous drugs, which marijuana, of course, is not a gateway drug, but there are aspects of prohibition that bring about that switch, as you just outlined. And it's very important and to recognize that, and that's not usually a part of the narrative.
Yes, that's right. In the gateway theory of marijuana, which a federal bureaucrat, Henry Anslinger, made up on the spot while testifying in front of Congress, the scientists who testified said that all the claims about marijuana being deadly, marijuana being addictive, marijuana leading to insanity, violent crime, etc., they disproved all that on the floor of Congress. And Harry Anslinger got up and said, well, that may be true, but marijuana is a gateway drug to these higher drugs. And that claim has been thoroughly discredited by scientists, not by libertarians, not by economists. That theory of the gateway approach has been discredited in every respect. And actually, as we've discussed in this interview, it's actually the other way around. It's the war on drugs that can lure people in and then lead them down the path to higher potency, more dangerous drugs is what's actually going on. And one of the things I did in my article was I showed that drug legalization can actually help and reverse this heroin epidemic.
All right, and we'll definitely get to that. But before we do, I want to return to the subject of legal drugs. And you've obviously touched on this, but it really is critical to understand that subject to understand what's going on here. So one of the things you discuss in your article are legal opiates. So what are legal opiates, and how and why do the FDA and Big Pharma promote their use and their being prescribed?
Well, there's several legal opiates, and there's different versions of some of them. But the two most prominent, the two largest selling, are Vicodin and Oxycontin. And those were created as a way of avoiding using heroin in a medical practice. And so they're not exactly the same as heroin. And they are legal, and they are prescribed in very large numbers, shockingly large numbers. And but they were supposed to be, a substitute for heroin. There was a lot of complaints many years ago that the federal government was stymieing the ability of physicians to deal with patients with tremendous pain problems. And so the federal government was limiting their options. They were overseeing them, and they didn't want that. And so in comes the legal opiates. And, basically they were arguing in the old day that, okay, we've got a terminal cancer patient under care and basically in extreme pain, but the federal government didn't want to use heroin as a remedy for that. And it would be a wonderful remedy because it gives you, all the pain relieving qualities of a drug, but it also creates a little bit, depending on how much you use and how long it stays in your system, a more euphoric mental state. And so it's calming for these terminal cancer patients. It would be the preferred drug, I think, of choice for patients under this situation. But the federal government did not want to allow physicians to demonstrate that heroin had any medical use, because that's behind their guidelines or their scheduling and how they've scheduled drugs. And the most severe schedule of drugs includes heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. So these are drugs which the federal government says are clearly a potential danger to the user and that they have no medical value. And so that's the thing that generated these legal opiates, is simply the federal government and its bureaucrats didn't want to be shown to being harmful in the medical process. And of course now we've seen all too clearly that marijuana has no real negative, it still presents some dangers, but not in the same sense. And that it has significant medical value. Marijuana, first it was discovered that marijuana was good for all of the things you need in order to heal yourself. So it improves your ability to sleep, it reduces pain, it reduces anxiety, and it induces appetite. So you're eating, you're calm, you're pain-free, and you can sleep. Those are the things you need to heal. And so we've known that for a long time, and it's one of the best things you can take for those problems. Now, in more recent years, we've learned that marijuana and its various components, even hemp, can be used to treat a variety of medical problems, and these include curing some cancer tumors in the brain, certain blood cancers, seizures in little children who are having hundreds of seizures a day, not getting enough nutrition to be able to grow properly, to sleep properly, to concentrate, to go to school, and a little bit of marijuana without THC, the psychoactive ingredient, has been able to virtually stop all of these seizures, this type of particular seizure. And right now there's dozens of companies which are working on and studying and doing research on the use of cannabis, marijuana, and its various components to provide other types of medical treatments. And the great thing about these products are that they typically do not have any side effects, that they typically do not have any drug interactions. So the patients can go on consuming their prescribed drugs as well, and they don't have to worry about marijuana or hemp oil or whatever it happens to be causing additional side effects or interactions with those drugs. But they're also looking at being able to cure certain diseases and illnesses and cancers, and to possibly prevent some of these things from happening, as well as providing remedial treatments of the type that we've known for a long time in terms of eating, sleeping, pain-free, anti-anxiety. And I know there's other companies that are working on replacing anti-anxiety drugs with marijuana, and a lot of the anti-depression, bipolar type stuff, that they can either solve those problems independently or can solve those problems in conjunction with the existing drugs, but at lower potencies. So it's very exciting to see, the medical applications, the economic growth that's occurring in places where they've legalized marijuana. But more importantly, as an Austrian economist and somebody who's been working in this field for so long, is people's minds have changed with respect to drugs. And the vast majority of now do not want to see a law enforcement solution to this problem. They want either legalization of medical marijuana, legalization of recreational marijuana. They don't want to see the law enforcement solution with harder drugs. They want to see a medical solution. They want to see private solutions. And so people's minds have changed. When the war on drugs started in 1972, only 12% of the American public thought that recreational marijuana should be allowed at all. And, of course, that probably represented the population of people who were already smoking marijuana. Today, the population that thinks that recreational marijuana should be allowed is 62% in a Gallup poll recently. And the percentage that support medical marijuana is way above 80%. And so we've seen an entire sea change between 1972 and today, and I expect that to continue. It's very easily going to continue because if you look at the age breakdown of who supports legalization and who doesn't, well, all of the younger age groups up into the 50s, the majority support legalizing marijuana in some form. It's only the older people, the older age brackets, late 50s, 60s, and 70s and higher, that oppose it in terms of the majority. And I've also looked at these kind of polling numbers before, and when you look inside of there, what you see is that within each age bracket, the people who are better educated, that work full-time, that have a college degree, that are middle class or above, those people overwhelmingly support legalization. And it's only within these age groups that you see people with less than a high school degree, people working part-time. The very religious tend to oppose legalization, although that has changed. Dr. Robertson, can't think of his first name right now, but he came out for legalizing marijuana. And so even religious leaders of a very conservative evangelical sort support this. And, the reason they do is they see that it's ruining people's lives, that it's harming minorities, that it's injuring people in their churches, whether that's the overdose of a child, whether that's the imprisonment of a father, whether that's gunfire between rival gangs. This is not really producing any positive, beneficial results at all. It's just producing a nasty social cost, and it's my hope that, of course, goes all away.
Well, and of course, we now have some examples of what legalization would look like and what the effects of that would be in the western U.S., in Washington and Colorado and Oregon and Alaska. And then, of course, there's the Portuguese situation, and then also the legalization of marijuana in Uruguay. So we have some examples of this. But what would legalization in the U.S. on a larger scale look like? And how would ending the war on drugs be the cure for this heroin epidemic, and what would a free market in heroin look like?
Yeah, you're right. Everywhere we look where there's even some liberalization, things improve. Portugal liberalized all drug laws so that consumers would not be thrown in jail. And they went from the worst situation with illegal drugs to the best. And so that's very instructive. And also the UN is right now rewriting its guidelines, and many countries are ready and waiting to reform their laws. And so I'm very optimistic moving forward, even in the short run, about what's going to be happening in the United States and elsewhere. And I think it's something that you can relate to Brexit and the Trump phenomenon, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, is that people are in a negative social mood. They don't believe in their government. They realize that government is the problem, not the cure. So in the United States, with legalization coming, I fully expect that marijuana for medical purposes, marijuana for recreational purposes will be legalized and taxed, and certainly this would result in an economic crisis around the corner when government budgets are strapped for cash. So that's another factor that's going to push this through. But also, I think that as countries and states experiment, what you're going to find is that if we allow somewhat legal drugs in heroin and cocaine, other things, that they will become available in legal pharmaceutical grade form. Now, you might have to get a prescription, you might have to enter a treatment program, you might have to be put on some other control program in order to access pharmaceutical grade, inexpensive drugs like heroin. And, so you could have a medical solution, you could have a commercial solution where you really open it up to companies, but you say, okay, if you're going to sell this stuff, you're going to be liable for any negligence in the way you sell it and market it and so on and so forth, so that companies selling legal heroin would be incentivized to produce a product that was truly safe. And, back in the old day, bare heroin pills were of a very low potency, and you couldn't easily break it down and put it into a form where you could inject it in a highly potent form or smoke it or anything like that. And of course, one of the big dealers in cocaine was the Coca-Cola Company, and it sold its product with cocaine in it, but there's no way you could become even strongly intoxicated with the cocaine in that product because there wasn't really a whole lot in there. And the Coca-Cola Company really wasn't killing anybody, and nobody was suffering from these kind of products. And so you can have the commercial solution like that. You can have a medical solution or both for even some of the harder drugs. And by the way, so you wouldn't have as many overdoses here as we have today. And also, it's ironic, but marijuana achieves many of the types of things that heroin addicts need to become unaddicted to heroin. They relieve pain, they induce appetite, they reduce anxiety, it allows for more sleep. And heroin addiction is very difficult. That's why people don't want to become, they don't want to get off of their addiction because it is so painful, and you are nauseous, and you lose weight, and you can't sleep, and you sweat, and you're in pain. And it's ironic that marijuana is considered by heroin addicts to be one of the best pathways off of a heroin addiction. So, legalized marijuana would allow us to retract some of these people who have been forced into heroin addiction by the war on drugs and to get them into a better place.
Well, that's definitely interesting, and I want to thank you for laying out what heroin and cocaine and other hard drugs, what their distribution and use might look like in a free market setting, because while there's an increasing public consensus, even definitely popularity behind the legalization of marijuana, that doesn't seem to be the case with some of these harder drugs. So thanks for laying that out, and I'm glad we were able to look at how the war on drugs and the problems with the war on drugs go beyond just the fact that you have overcrowded prisons, which of course is horrible, and it's horrible you have all these people in prison for minor drug offenses, but how you have all these effects with black markets, with potency, with toxic chemicals being mixed into drugs, with harder drugs being used because of the war on drugs, with increased violence. There are just so many problems resulting from the war on drugs. So I'm glad we were able to take a look at those. For someone who wants to learn more about the heroin epidemic, more about the war on drugs, and more about the problems related to the war on drugs, what resources and readings and books do you recommend they take a look at?
Well, just Google the Mises Institute or go to mises.org. We've got lots of stuff on the drug war. We have lots of stuff on everything. And we've got a great blog that's called the Mises Wire, where we have some of the best, brightest, and youngest Austrian economists from all around the world making daily commentary. And so you're getting a unique Austrian economic perspective on things like Brexit, on things like the Federal Reserve, on things like the war on drugs, and the Donald Trump campaign, and, just all sorts of things. It's a wonderful resource. It's the world's largest economic webpage, and it's all written for the common man. Even our academic journal is something that everybody can read and understand, unlike mainstream economic journals and jargon. And so I encourage everybody to do that and to sign up for our daily article, to visit our blog. It's a wonderful resource. It's open 24/7, 365. There's no fees to browse the web page. There's no registration required. And, there's tens of thousands of people from around the globe, really, that have created a very unique community that's based on Austrian economics and libertarian principles. And so make it job number one to educate yourself about what the mainstream media is doing to you and doing to us. And what shows like yours, Adam Wake Up Call, is designed to get the word out on all that you need to get better educated to fight the power of the big government.
Well, and I entirely agree with your recommendation of the Mises Institute and Mises.org and the Mises Wire blog and the Mises Daily articles. I highly recommend that everybody check those out. What are the best ways to follow your work, though, in particular?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Dr. Mark Thornton, and I have a Facebook page, and I'm on the Mises Wire occasionally. Right now, Adam, I'm actually working on a new book on the skyscraper curse, so I haven't been paying as much attention But I have two new articles in the recent issue of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. One is a review essay on the book Fishing for Fools by George Akerlof and Robert Shiller, which shows that these Nobel Prize-winning economists are just, well, they're either stupid or dishonest. I don't know what the conclusion is, but the review essay points all that out. And the other one is an article in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. It's called Transparency or Deception, What the Fed Was Saying in 2007. And this article looks at the period between the housing bubble and the financial crisis in 2007 and what major top Federal Reserve officials, what they were saying about the economy, economic growth, all these new financial products such as credit default swaps, mortgage-backed obligations, and it's really revealing, and it's really an unveiling of the ignorance or the deception that exists at the Federal Reserve. So in this new issue, basically I'm covering the government bureaucrats at the Federal Reserve, as well as, in the other article, academic economists at their very worst, basically. And I hope that when they read that article reviewing Akerlof and Shiller, the book Fishing for Fools, is that by the time you get to the end of the article, you're either laughing or you're crying.
All right, well, very good. And I want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/heroin. That's the show notes page for this episode. And, of course, we'll link to the Mises Institute and to those articles you just mentioned, and, of course, to the article that we've more or less been discussing over the course of this interview, which is the Legalization Cure for the Heroin Epidemic. That's on the Mises Institute's website at mises.org, and there will also be a link, as I mentioned, at the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/heroin. And I want to encourage everybody to sign up for our email list so they can stay up to date on what's going on with the show, and to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or the podcatcher of your preference so you can make sure to never miss an episode. And Mark, I want to thank you for joining me today and for being so generous with your time, and we'll have to do it again sometime soon. We can talk about the skyscraper curse next time, a very interesting topic that sheds some interesting light on what's going on and reaches some interesting conclusions. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.